Okay, Parsha illuminated for another double Parsha, Parsha's Behar Bechukosai. And I hope that we will touch on both, a little bit of Behar and a little bit of Bechukosai, and even one idea that overlaps the two Parshas. So we'll begin at the beginning, which is the beginning of Parshas Behar talks about the commandment of Shemittah, to let the land of Israel lay fallow every 7 years. And we could begin in the beginning of chapter 25, Perek Chafei, Pasuk Aleph, verse 1, Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Behar Sinai Lemor. Hashem spoke to Moshe at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, saying, Daber al b'nei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel, v'amarta lehem, and say to them, Ki savo al haaretz ani nosein lachem, when you come to the land that I give you, v'shavsa haaretz shabbos Hashem, the land shall rest a Sabbath to the Lord. Sheish shanim tizras adecha, for 6 years you shall plant your field. V'sheish shanim tizmar karmecha, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard. V'asaftas tvosa, and gather in your produce. Uvashana shavi'is, but in the 7th year, Shabbos Shabbosang Yalaretz, it shall be a Shabbos Shabbosang, a complete Sabbath for the land. Shabbos Lashem, a Sabbath to God. Sadcha lo sizra, then you shall not plant your field. V'chaymecha lo sizmor, you shall not prune your vineyard. A sefiach kitzircha lo siktzar, you shall not reap here they say the aftergrowth of your harvest, meaning even things that grow on their own, even though you didn't plant. And the grapes that here they say that you have set aside, you shall not harvest them. It shall be a year of rest for the land. So it says not to harvest. We'll see in the next verse it says that you can harvest. We mean don't harvest like take it all in for yourself. You can take in what you need for short periods of time, but you can't just harvest the whole thing. Rather, it shall be the produce of the land, the Sabbath of the land, shall be for you to eat, for you, and for your servants, and for your workers, and those who reside with you, who live with you, and for your animals. Fine. Okay, so that's the basic mitzvah of Shemitah. 6 years you work the land, and in the 7th year, the land rests. What's the idea behind the mitzvah of Shemitah? So, whenever it comes to mitzvos and the reasons of mitzvos, unless the Torah says explicitly the reason, then we are just offering suggestions, offering tam means reason, it also means taste, a taste of the mitzvah, a bit of an understanding. And the Sefer HaChinuch is usually the first stop to learn about what the reasons behind mitzvahs are. Sefer HaChinuch is a medieval work that actually goes through all the mitzvahs, gives basic descriptions of them, and then also offers what he calls a shorish, a root, which is usually a reason, and sometimes more than one. So here actually he gives more than one. Let's jump it down to the bottom source of page 1 if you're following. He says, Mishar Shea Mitzvah, among the roots of this commandment, Likboa Bilibenu, it's to affixing our hearts, Uletzayer Tzir Chazak Machashavtenu, and make a strong impression in our minds, Inyan Chidush HaOlam, the idea that the world has been created by God, that it wasn't always there, that the world is a creation. Ki Sheshes Yom Masa Hashem, oh, there's the name of God in there, that's Shemos. Sheshes Yom Masa Hashem, Esa Shemayim Esa Aretz, Uvayom Hashvi, Davar Hichse Menucha Alatzmo. So for 6 days God created the heavens and the earth. On the 7th day he did not create anything. He imposed rest on himself. In order to uproot any belief in anything else and that the world was always here, Asher Yaminu HaKofrim BaTorah, like those deniers in the Torah believe, it destroys the principles and breaks down the walls around the Torah. So the obligation is upon us every day and every year to counteract any other belief Limno sheishana milishbos b'shvis, and therefore to count 6 years and to rest on the seventh. And therefore we will never forget this idea. And he says, it's very similar to that we count 6 days during the week, and then on the seventh is a day of rest. And therefore, that's why we relinquish ownership over whatever grows this year, the seventh year. Besides for resting, we also relinquish our ownership today. It's to remember that the land that produces produce every year, it's not by our own might and virtue that it brings forth produce, because there's a master over it and a master over its masters. And when he wants, he will command us to relinquish our ownership. So the Sefer Chinuch says kind of two ideas or two aspects of Shemitah that lead us to the same conclusion, and that conclusion is that we're to remember through Shemitah that God created the world in 6 days and resting on the seventh, similar to what we do for Shabbos. We work 6 days during the week, and on the seventh we rest. So we work 6 years, and on the seventh we rest. That recalls that Hashem created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And not only that, but not only do we rest and not work the land, but we also relinquish ownership. Anyone is allowed to come and collect from anyone else's fields, because by letting go and relinquishing ownership, we remind ourselves that that the land doesn't produce because of our own skill and might. It is Hashem that causes, it's really His land, and it's He who causes the land to grow, to produce fruits and other produce. So, and then he gives a couple other reasons, but we'll leave them aside for now. And but this is the number one reason offered by the Sefer Chinuch, that Shemitah is in order to recall, just like Shabbos, like Hashem created the world, and that the land is not ours; it ultimately belongs to Hashem, and we relinquish our ownership to remind us of that. Now, if that was the only reason, or not the only reason, but if that is the reason, then we might pose the following question. Well, Shabbos we have to keep whether we live in the land of Israel or not. So if Shemitah is meant to remind us, just like Shabbos, that 6 days Hashem created the world and on the seventh day He rested, then why would the laws of Shemitah be restricted to the land of Israel? Even someone who owns property owns a field outside the land of Israel should be keeping the laws of Shemitah. But that's not the halacha, that's not the law. The law is ki savo ala aretz. When you come to the land, and it's specifically in the land of Israel that Shemitah needs to be observed and not out. Furthermore, maybe we could ask that if it's as fundamental as Shabbos, then maybe it should be part of the Ten Commandments alongside Shabbos. Perhaps. These are questions posed by the Alshich, and in the Alshich style, or Moshe Alshich, he asks many questions, and we'll get to some of his other ones, and then gives like one answer that tries to hit all the points. Before we go on with the Alshich, I want to look ahead for a moment to Parsha's Bechukosai, where the topic of Shemitah comes up again. And in Bechukosai, we have what we call the Tochacha, the rebuke, where Moshe transmits God's rebuke, but that basically says if you follow the Torah, you get rewarded. If you don't, then all sorts of terrible things can happen to us. And within the Tochacha, we have the following. It's chapter 26, verse 32. Perek Chavav, Pasuk Lamed Beis, Vashimosi ani es haaretz. God says, I will make the land desolate. Vishamu aleha oivechem hayoshvim ba. It will become desolate of your enemies who live in it. Veschem ezareh bagoyim, and you I will scatter among the nations. I will unsheath the sword after you. Your land will be desolate, and your cities will be laid to waste. And then it says, then the land will be appeased regarding its Shabbosos, its sabbaticals, its Sabbaths. Kol yemei hashama, all the days of that it's now desolate. Vatem ba'aretz ayvechem, while we are in the land, while you are in the lands of your enemies. Az tishbas haaretz, then the land will rest. Behar shabbososeh, and it will thus appease its sabbaticals. Kol yemei hashama tishbos, es asher lo shavsa b'shabbososechem b'shiftechem aleh. It will rest during all the days that it remains desolate, whatever it had not rested on your sabbaticals when you lived upon it. Says the Tochacha that when we are thrown out of the land of Israel, the land of Israel will finally be able to rest all of those Shemittahs, all of those Shabboses that it didn't get to rest while we were in the land, implying that part of on the list of sins that got us thrown out was that we did not keep the laws of Shemittah. And if you go back now to page 1, to our Parsha, and you look at Perek Chafei, chapter 25, verse Yudches, it says, Vasisemes Bechukosai mishpatai tishmeru, you should perform my statutes, guard my ordinances, Vasisemosam, perform them, Vishaftem ala aretz levatach, then you will live on the land securely. If you keep the mitzvahs of Shemitah, then you will live on the land securely. And to that Rashi comments, Shebavon Shemitah Yisrael Golem, because it's for the sin of Shemitah, for not observing Shemitah, that we get thrown into exile. Shenemar, as the verse says, what we just read, then the land will take back its Shemitah. V'shivim shana shel galus Babel k'neged shivim Shemitah shebitlu hayu. Says Rashi, the 70 years of exile in Babylonia corresponded to 70 Shemitahs that we did not keep after entering the land of Israel. So it seems we weren't so good at keeping the laws of Shemitah, and for that we got corresponding 70 years of exile. Now, what is the relationship? Why is it that if we don't keep Shemitah, then we get thrown out of the land? Well, on a most basic level, it's very simple. Shemitah is our declaration that the land belongs to God. And if we are not willing to indicate, to show that, then God says, well, if you don't recognize that this belongs to me, I gave it to you, then you lose it. That's what the Medrash comments. It says, I said that you should plant for 6 years and rest for a 7th, so that you know that the land is mine. But you didn't do so, so you're going to be sent into Golus, into exile, and then you'll understand. Then the land will take back its Shemitah. We'll get to rest as it was supposed to. So on the most basic level, it's very simple. You don't keep Shemitah. You don't acknowledge that the land belongs to me. God says, then you're going to lose your opportunity to be in the land. But the Alshich develops an idea that I think takes this to maybe another level of understanding. And before we see the Alshich's approach, we have to first pose some of his questions. So he asked many questions. I'm just going to pick out a few, and they're based on the text from the beginning of Parshas Behar, chapter 25. So first of all, it says in verse 2, Pasuk Beis, it says, "Tell them ki savo al haaretz asher ani nosein lachem." When you come to the land that I am giving you. Why does he have to say that I am giving you? It's seemingly superfluous. We know that God is giving us this land. Everything belongs to God. Why do we say that it's the land that I am giving you? Why is it called a Shabbos la Hashem? It's a Shabbos unto God. It's really a Shabbos of the land. It's not, it's the land's Shabbos. The land is having a sabbatical. It's not a Shabbos of God. Why does it say um, in verse Daled, Pasuk 4, verse 4, Pasuk Daled, it says Shabbos la Hashem, a Shabbos unto Hashem. Um, Also, in verse 6, Pasuk Vav, it says, so the Shabbos should be for you to eat from it. What does that mean? It should be for, in order to eat. Um, Actually, even before that, let me go back to Pasuk Gimel, verse 3. It says, Sheishanim tizora sadecha, v'sheishanim tizmor karmecha. For 6 years you should plant your field, and 6 years prune your vineyards. Why does it have to instruct me to plant and do that for 6 years? Just say, get right to the point. Tell us the mitzvah. That's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to rest on the 7th year. So just tell me, rest on the 7th year. Why does it say to gathering your produce? Again, that's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to rest in the 7th year. Okay, so the Alshich, like the Sefer HaChinuch, understands that indeed Shemittah is to remind us that Hashem created the world. Just like Shabbos reminds us 6 days God created the world, on the 7th day he rested. Shemittah as well is to remind us of that. But there's a difference in the way that he approaches it and the way that the Sefer HaChinuch approaches it. And the difference will help us answer what we asked before. Why is this only in the land of Israel and not the rest of the world, in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora as well? In order to understand that, we have to go way back to Bereshis, Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1, the very first Rashi in the Torah. And the very first Rashi in the Torah, Rashi says, it's on the source sheet, bottom of page 2, Bereshis, in the beginning, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Lo haya tzarich lahasklas haTorah ela me'achodesh zelachem. Really, the Torah could have started from the first mitzvah, which is in Parshas Bo, the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. So, why did it start with Bereshis? Why did it start with the creation? Okay, there's many ways you can answer this question, but Rashi's answer is very important, fundamental. It says Rashi, Mishum koach ma'asav higid la'amo l'asislam nachlas goyim. He quotes a verse in Tehillim that Hashem, the strength of his works to relate to his people, to give them the inheritance of the nations. What does that mean? It says Rashi, Sheim yomru umos ha'olam li'Yisrael listim atem. If the nations of the world tell us, you are listim, you are bandits, you stole this land from us, the land of Israel, so we can tell them, every land belongs to God. He created it. He gave it to the one who he wanted to. He originally gave it to the 7 nations, the Canaanite nations, and willingly he took it from them and gave it to us. So explains Rashi, the reason why we need to begin with the story of the creation of the world is because we want to make it clear, we want it to be clear that God created the world, and that is what proves our right to the land of Israel, because if God created the world, everything belongs to him. He created the land of Israel as well, and it is his, and he originally gave it to the 7 Canaanite nations, and he took it from them, and he gave it to us. Now, just as an aside, not an aside, but this is not what the Alshich says, but it's very important, I think, to consider. I was always bothered, well, how does that prove that we have the right to the land of Israel? As soon as somebody else comes and takes it from us, they will say, well, look at Rashi. God created the world. He takes it, he gives it, and he takes it, and he gives it to whoever he wants. So basically, whoever has it right now, that's who can say that it belongs to us. So when the Greeks took over the land of Israel, they can make that claim, and when the Romans took it over, and then it was in the Christian hands, and then it was in the Muslim hands. So the Turks, everybody, the British, everybody can say it's our land because look, God created the world. He gives it to whom he wants. So actually, the Be'er Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Salant, in Parshas Shalach, talks about this in the context of the Meraglim, of the spies, and I won't go into his entire approach, but to answer this question, he suggests that what we're really saying is that because God gave it to us in a miraculous way, that's what demonstrates our right to the land. It's not because simply that we have the land, but it's that the land was given to us in a miraculous fashion when we entered the land of Israel. That's how we know God gave it to us. Nobody, just because somebody conquers a land doesn't mean that God gave it to them. But if you conquer a land through miracles, through opening miracles, then it means that God gave it to them, and that is our claim. And again, whether the nations of the world are going to accept it or not is not really the point. It's for ourselves to understand what our claim is, and we remind ourselves Hashem created the world, it's his land, and he gives it to whom he wishes. So based on this Rashi, says the Alshich, that when we practice Shemitah, when we observe we work the land for six years and then rest on the seventh, which reminds us, like we said, just like Shabbos, that God created the world. So this is a statement that we make that, remember, Bereshis, remember the first Rashi in Bereshis, remember, God created the world. When we are in the land, when you come to the land of Israel, Kisavo al arts, asher ani nosein lachem, that I gave you, the verse says. You come to the land that I gave you, because that's the key here, is that we are testifying, we are reminding ourselves, reminding others that this is the land that God gave us. How do we testify to that? Because we testify by resting on the seventh year. We testify that God created the world, and he created it, and he gives it to whom he wishes. And we're not bandits, like the language Rashi uses. Listim, they might accuse us of being bandits and stealing it, but no, we by practicing Shemitah, we demonstrate and we remind ourselves and the world that this is God's land he created and he gave it to whom he wishes. And that's why it says, Asher ani nosein lachem, that I give you. And he says that's why there's no Shemitah outside the land of Israel. Because this is actually very particular to the land of Israel, because we're not simply testifying that God created the world. That we do every week. That we do with Shabbos. 6 days we work, seventh day we rest. That's a reminder that God created the world. But Shemitah, it does remind us of that, but that's not the purpose of it. The purpose, he says, is the main purpose is specifically with regards to the land of Israel, that Hashem created the world and he gave us this land, and therefore we have the right to this land. And he says that's also why it's not in the Ten Commandments, because it's not as fundamental in the same sense as Shabbos itself. Shabbos itself is, this foundation of belief in God, of God creating the world. This is important too, as a proof, so to speak, that the land of Israel belongs to us, but it's not a Ten Commandment type of mitzvah. So that explains why it's only in the land of Israel, because it's proving our right to the land of Israel, and also why it's not part of the Ten Commandments. Now, one might say that, no, Shemitah, letting the land lie fallow for the seventh year, it's very logical. The land needs to rest. You need to give the land a break. So one response to that, he doesn't say this, but what some commentaries say is, well, if that was the purpose, then you wouldn't let all your land lie fallow the same year. You would switch off years. You'd let one field lie fallow one year and then another field another year. But the Alshich says that the Torah itself is coming to contradict such a notion that we're doing it just so that the land can rest, so that it can grow better. Says the Torah that for 6 years you'll plant, and for 6 years you'll prune, and you'll gather in your produce, and guess what? Every single year it's going to produce top notch. It's not going to show any sign of needing a rest. For all 6 years it's going to be the same. You're going to have great crops for 6 years. You'll plant, 6 years you'll prune your vineyards, you'll gather in your produce, and it's not going to show any indication that it needs a rest. It's not why you're going to let it lie fallow for the 7th year because it needs a rest, because it's going to be going strong. That's what the Torah assures us, and even he says, well, he says first that's the blessing of the land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's this land that produces tremendously, and not only that, but even in the 7th year, it's going to grow. It's going to continue to grow, even though you're not working it, even though you're not working the land. It's going to continue to grow, as it says in verse 5, the things that continue to grow, you're not to harvest, because it will continue to grow. And you'll see, and imagine, he says, had you planted it, it would grow even more, right? It's not because it needs a rest, but rather it's a Shabbos LaHashem. It's not a rest for the land. The land doesn't need a rest. It's just a Shabbos LaHashem. It's a rest for the purpose of God, I suppose, meaning to remind us that God is the creator, and thereby, again, establish our rights to the land of Israel. So according to the Alshich, it's not just that we're reminding ourselves that God created the world, but this is actually part of our proof and our right to the land that over the other nations, that we say God created this land, and we show it, we demonstrate it by having Shemitah every 7 years, and by demonstrating that, we're also demonstrating that God created it and God gave it to us, and therefore it's our right to the land. Which perhaps, if we go down the path of the Alshich, we now have another layer of understanding of why if we don't observe Shemitah, then we get thrown out of the land, we get exiled, and other nations come and conquer it from us, because we are basically giving them the okay to do so. If we're not keeping Shemitah, then, and we're not testifying that God is the creator of the land, then we're basically taking away our proof, our document that our proof that this land is rightfully ours. And that's an invitation to the other nations to come and take it over and exile us. So I think based on the Alshich, we have maybe a new layer. It's not just that God says it's my land, and if you don't demonstrate that, then you get thrown out. It's that it's my land, and if you don't demonstrate that, then you're inviting the other nations in, because you're removing your proof that you have the right to it, because your entire proof is that I created this and I give it to whom I want. And if you fail to demonstrate that by keeping Shemitah, then you invite the other nations to come and take it over from you. So this is for me at least a kind of a new perspective on Shemitah, and nowadays Shemitah is rabbinic, but it's still observed in the land of Israel, and still a very, very dear mitzvah to us. Okay, one more thought actually before we turn to Parshas Bechukosai, that I saw, which also relates to what we're discussing, which is that so if we go again to Parshas Bechukosai, the verses about Shemitah, which we read before. So in chapter 26, verse 34, it says, actually even before that, it says in verse 32, it says, I'll make the land desolate, so it'll become desolate of your enemies who live in it. Right? It sounds like even there won't be enemies there. And then it says, then the land will have its Shemitah. So So fine. So when there's no enemies there, then the land will get its rest. But asks the Melechus Machshavas that in the exile, usually when we've been exiled, even during the Babylonian exile, and certainly he says in our current exile, it hasn't just for many times it wasn't getting its Shemitah because there other nations were occupying it, and we're not observing Shemitah, and we're working the land consistently. And so, in what way did the land get its rest? That's the question asked by the Melechus Machshavas. And his answer is very interesting. And he says that the truth is, um, he says in a certain way the land does get its rest. Because the way that the produce grows in the land of Israel when the Jewish people are occupying it is not the same way it grows when everybody else is occupying it. He says that yes, indeed, when they come, if other nations take over the land and they try to plant, it will grow. It will grow like any other land that if you plant, things grow. That's the nature that God put into the world. Of course, God's the one who allows it to grow, but that's the system He created. But when the Jewish people are in the land of Israel, it's something more than that. Like we said, it's a land that's flowing with milk and honey. It's a land that produces in a remarkable way for the Jewish people. And so when the Jewish people are occupying the land of Israel, the land is working overdrive. It has to produce way more than what it would normally produce under other circumstances. That's the blessing that we have. That's the blessing, actually, that the Pasuk tells us. It says, really at the beginning of Parsha Bechukosai, when we observe the mitzvos, it says God will send the rain and the land will give its produce and in a remarkable fashion. And in a certain way that the land is overworked. And so it needs a rest. It needs a rest every 7 years because of the remarkable production, the remarkable production that the land gives when the Jewish people are there. But when other nations are there, then it no longer needs that rest. It doesn't need to it doesn't work overdrive. Yes, stuff still grows, but it doesn't work in the same miraculous fashion, and therefore it doesn't need the Shemitahs anymore. So he says, yes, when we get exiled, then there will be other nations there, but because the land is not producing in this remarkable way, it's in a certain sense getting its rest, and when we're in exile, it does indeed get its rest. And this again is certainly, I think, we've seen in our own times where once the Jewish people returned to the land of Israel in a significant way, all of a sudden, again, the land became, again, with Hashem's help and the technology and the passion that Hashem instilled within the people living in the land of Israel, but it has produced in a remarkable way agriculturally since our return in the last, or since a more significant return in the last 100 years or so. And when other nations were living in Israel over the last 1,000 years, it just wasn't the same. Much of it was unusable, unplantable, and ever since we've returned in significant numbers. Again, the land is Eretz Zavas Chalav Udavash. It flows with milk and honey. It produces in a remarkable way. But like I said, we still have to, therefore, continue to keep Shemitah, even if it's only rabbinic at this point. Okay. So okay, so someone had asked, is that observable that scientifically that it produces remarkably? I mean, it definitely. I think again, I'm not. I can't say what his. My impression is that it's something to be amazed at how much Israel it produces, considering its size and its climate, and comparing it to what was what was being accomplished before we really, established ourselves there again. I think it's quite significant, but you have to look into that further to verify. Okay, turning to Parshas Bechukosai, the beginning of the Parsha begins, Im Bechukosai telechu, if you walk in my statutes, ves mitzvosai tishmeru, and you guard my mitzvos, vasisemosam, and you do them, then God promises, v'nasati gishmechem bitam, I will give your rain in its time, v'nasnaret zivula, v'etz hasadeh yiteng pirya, and the land will yield its produce, and the tree of the field will give forth its fruit. And Rashi comments, somewhat of a famous Rashi. Rashi wonders, what is the difference between im b'chukosai telechu, if you walk in my statutes, ves mitzvosai tishmeru, and you guard my mitzvos? What's the difference between walking in my statutes and guarding my mitzvos? And Rashi says, you might have thought that walking in my statutes refers to the fulfillment of the commandments. However, when the Torah says, observe my commandments, so it already says to keep the mitzvos. So what is the meaning of if you follow or if you walk in my statutes? It means, in the Hebrew, shetiyu amelim baTorah, that you must toil in the study of Torah, or you should toil in the study of Torah. So im b'chukosai telechu means you should toil in the study of Torah. Now, the commentaries point out that it's not simply because it's extra, what could it mean? Let's just choose toil in Torah, but it's derived from the language itself. Different approaches among different commentaries. The Maharal says that because it says im b'chukosai telechu, you should walk in my statutes. Well, walking implies something that takes effort, that involves toil, and therefore it means to toil in Torah. And then he adds also that the words that walking also implies that you are getting from one place to another. And within the study of Torah, to get from one place to another, you have to work hard, you have to toil. It doesn't just come easy, and it doesn't just come free. It takes effort, it takes concentration, it takes discipline, but by putting in that effort, by toiling in our Torah study, then we will get from place to place. In other words, what we mean by place to place, we'll reach new places, we'll reach new heights, we'll reach new depths, meaning we'll discover, we'll go deeper, and each time we learn, we'll be in a new place. It won't be the same as the previous time, as long as we are learning with the proper effort, with toil. And that's, says the Maharal, that's the idea of that's why telechu, if you walk, implies toiling. It's only through toil that we get from one place to another in our Torah study. The Kli Yakar has a very different understanding here. The Kli Yakar says that the type of toil we mean, the type of effort we mean, is specifically the idea of being koveya itim la Torah, of setting set times to study Torah. The Gemara famously says that when we come up to the heavenly court, God is going to ask us 6 questions, and one of them, second one I think, is kavata itim la Torah. Did you set times to study Torah, or was it just whenever it's convenient? So there's an ideal to set times to study Torah, and the Kli Yakar says that's what we're referring to here. Im bechukosai telechu means, he says the word bechukosai comes from the word chok, which is like a set law, and it means the set times. If you walk with set times, chok v'lo yavor, it's set. You're not you won't let it pass. You're insistent that if you have a set time, you won't let anything get in the way of that time for studying Torah. And he says that, first of all, that's implied by the fact that it says b'chukosai telechu. Chukim often means the laws we don't understand the reasons for, but we never find it says to go in the chukim, in the laws. It must mean something else here, and and therefore it means if you go with set times. Now, what does it mean to go with set times? Says the Kli Yakar, really based on another medrash on this pasuk. The medrash quotes the verse in Tehillim. The medrash says that the verse in Tehillim in chapter 119, verse 59, is a fulfillment of our verse. What does it say there? It says, King David, David HaMelech says, Chashavti darki, I thought about my way, and my legs took me to your laws, to your Torah. Says the Medrash that David, King David, turns to God and he says, Master of the world, every day I thought I was going to a certain place, but my feet took me straight to the base Medrash, straight to the study hall. And he says, that's Bechukosai telechu. If you go in my statutes, in other words, says the Kli Yakar, if you have set times for learning such that it's second nature, it's automatic, that you walk, your legs take you to your, it's routine, that every day at this time, this is where I go. This is what I do at this time. It could be actual going, it could be going online, it could be going to your bookshelf. But if you have set times for study, it becomes automatic. And that's the type of toil, type of effort that we're talking about, is, I guess, toiling to establish these times and insisting on them. And the reward is midah k'neged midah, measure for measure. If you set times for Torah study, then I will give rain in its proper time. If you learning in its proper time, then your reward will be rain in its proper time. That's how the Kli Yakar understands this. And just to close, one other idea, that another way to explain the correlation between toiling in Torah and rain in its time, and produce and sustenance, the Ohev Yisrael, one of the Hasidic rabbis, I think the Apter he was called. He says that something along the lines of the Maharal that we mentioned before. When one toils in Torah and they go deeper, they go from place to place, like we said before, a person gets to experience tremendous sweetness and joy and pleasure from their Torah learning. And when we're more laid back, we don't invest ourselves, then we don't get as much out of it, and we don't get the same pleasure. When we put in the effort and we toil, then we draw forth the real pleasure, the real sweetness of Torah study. And he says that that's the measure for measure, so to speak, over here. That if we toil and we invest ourselves and we draw forth the pleasures of the Torah, then Hashem will reward us with the pleasures of this world, of the land. And if we get tanug, if we get pleasure from our Torah study, then midah k'neged midah, measure for measure, Hashem gives us pleasure from the land itself. He gives the rain in its time, and produce and fruit from the tree, which is a beautiful idea. Which means that if we get pleasure, we get rewarded with pleasure, which is a great deal, if you ask me. And it's telling us that the more effort we put into our learning, the more we'll be able to draw forth. If we set times for learning and keep to them, then we'll be able to draw forth the most pleasure, the most sweetness from our Torah study. Okay, we'll hold there.